The pink racing car Chigiri Hyoma versus the lone swordsman Yukimiya Kenyu. The battle of the ticking bombs in Blue Lock. But despite the dangers both players are facing, this is a fight where swift and fast dribbles are the name of the game, as these two players alone with their speed and dribbles can take whole teams apart. And so in today's video we are going to look at their stats, abilities and explore their best feats to determine who is the dominator of drifting in Blue Lock. The Red Panther Chigiri Hyoma, one of the coolest characters in the show. Friendly, handsome, elegant, but more importantly, Chigiri is one of the few characters in Blue Lock who have a healthy normal personality, which is in complete contrast to the crazy people that exist in this show. However, this does not mean that Chigiri is not an egoist. In fact, he has one of the biggest egos in Blue Lock that pushes him to strive for nothing but to be the absolute best in the world. However, if anything is to be said about Chigiri, it has to do with one of his physical aspects. And so, without any further ado, let's start with his physical stats. And in reality, I'm not going to waste nobody's time. Chigiri's signature stat and his most selling point is without a doubt his speed. He is the best we've seen in the U20 category hands down. He beats even New Gen 11s, with the fastest of them being Kaiser. And in the entirety of the U20 category, only Zantetsu is considered a threat to the pink racing car. And even still, he only beats him in acceleration. When it comes to top speed, Chigiri completely demolishes Zantetsu. But, and despite this, I gotta say that his speed is within reach for the other Blue Lockers, as we saw many other fast players like Kuruna and Kaiser react to him, which is actually interesting and in complete contrast to the fastest player we know, Loki. You see, Loki was near impossible to react to once he started sprinting. Even Metavision and the Kaiser impacts were useless against him, which by the way is still insane. Chigiri was next to Kaiser yet he was not able to stop him. Yet we've got Loki who sprinted from a far position and he still was able to stop the Kaiser impact. I think this should put into perspective just how absurd Loki's speed is compared to Chigiri. And the reason I am bringing this up is before I've always thought that Chigiri, once he becomes a pro, he would reach Loki in terms of speed. However, after that performance, I truly believe that he probably will never reach that level, especially since he's already as old as Loki and the latter is just operating on a whole different level of speed. However, I want you not to confuse things here. This does not take a lot from Chigiri, as Loki is simply an anomaly. In terms of regular players, Chigiri is without a doubt one of the fastest, especially after training under Prince and achieving a level that he didn't even think was possible. But for now, let's carry on with his other stats, and then we will get back to exploring his speed in great detail when we reach his abilities and weapons. And so, first and after his speed, we gotta talk about his endurance. And while we are seeing him in the NEL being able to run a whole game with his insane speed, there is the whole thing with his knee. As in the U20 game, it was the reason he got sapped out, because he kept scaling the pitch repeatedly and he exhausted himself to the point he had to be sapped out. However, I doubt someone as caring as Prince would have let Chigiri off without giving him an insane training to strengthen the power of his knee. However, there is no confirmation for this. But I gotta say, his performance in the NEL is definitely reassuring, as we are seeing him constantly being able to run a whole game, which means we can at least assume that his endurance is off the charts, because keeping up that insane speed and that insane tenacity for a whole game requires just another level of endurance. But alright, next let's talk about his strength and his muscle mass, which is another case of a player greatly using his specs. You see, in order to be even able to achieve that speed, you need to be lean and skinny, and Chigiri definitely falls under this definition. However, I gotta say, his chargers were always strong enough for him to battle even the biggest of opponents, like he did with Bar in the second selection. And sure, it was basically his speed that enabled him to do this. However, this means that when the right conditions are met, Chigiri can ram into strong players and still win some of his physical duels, which definitely got even stronger after training under Prince again, as we've seen him even increase his muscle mass without sacrificing any of his speed. However, and finally, let's talk about his jumping ability, which remains his weakest stat, with actually no feats to speak of, as it really doesn't fit with his playing style to begin with. And so, enough about his physicality, and it's time for us to jump into his abilities and weapons. And as I said, this is where I am going to talk about Chigiri's speed as an ability rather than a stat, as basically the way he has been improving it goes beyond simple stat enhancement, which is really infuriating to think about since Loki basically wasted Zantetsu. Had the latter chose to go to England and train under Prince, he would have achieved another level. As for Chigiri, I don't even think it begins with training under Prince, because he was introducing new techniques and evolution paths to his speed to make it the formidable weapon that it is. The first of which is actually one that he added in the second selection, after realizing that the choke point of his speed is when he traps the ball. Chigiri began kicking the ball forward, then catching up to it faster than anyone, rather than de-accelerating, trap and then re-accelerating again. And while it seems small of a technique, this fits perfectly with him, as without giving any interval to the other players, Chigiri becomes a very deadly jet engine that no one really could catch once he starts accelerating, even with and while receiving the ball, which is just perfect. With his insane top speed, it really makes him untouchable. Well, unless his course is being cut, which actually for the most part was the biggest limiting factor to Chigiri. However, this is where the brilliance of Chris Prince shines again, as the next weapon, the next technique that Chigiri added to his arsenal, are his sharp and quick cuts and turns. Taking a page from Zantetsu and Baro and pushing it to the limit, Chigiri utilizes his speed in a new manner, by zigzagging around his opponents with his new and much improved acceleration, which is a direct counter and a very useful technique in dealing with players cutting his course, which as I said was one of the biggest hurdles for him. And by the way, this is yet another reason why I feel he is not reaching Loki's top speed, because Loki seems to burst in straight lines with brute speed that no one could really react to him, while Chigiri zigzags in and out his opponents. And funny enough, this training under Prince had the double effect, as due to his cuts being super fast, Chigiri now has one of the deadliest dribbling abilities in the U20 category, being even comparable to a beast of dribbling in Lorenzo, and actually second only to Bajira in the Neo Egoist League. However, I gotta say this, Chigiri's dribbling ability is rather special compared to the other dribbling moves we've seen before, and I can't help but get reminded of Noah's dribbling ability. Because while other dribblers either utilize techniques to throw the defender's timing and balance off like Lorenzo and Bachiro, or react to their opponent's movements and bypass them by changing the tempo or the dribbling moves like Sai and Hiyori, Chigiri on the other hand is much more simpler. As I said, he reminds me of Noah, as he just goes the most optimal route and he cuts through with brute unadulterated speed. And we've actually seen how deadly this is. First from Noah of course, but more importantly for today's matchup, we've seen how Bastard had to use all three of its speedsters together just to stop the Red Panther, further cementing the deadliness of his dribbling. But finally, let's talk about his 44 Golden Zone, which is his only ability that is not born directly from his speed. And honestly, again, it's just a testament to how brilliant Chris Prince is. I know Snuffy gets a lot of credit when it comes to training, however Prince is really underrated, and no one really understood the bodies of his players much like he did. As you see, you know how before and due to his speed, Chigiri always found himself in the corner crossing for other players like Karasu and Isiki. Well, Prince actually noticed that and utilized that crossing muscle memory built up and turned it into an insane shot at a 44 angle from the left, the opposite wing of where Chigiri used to play, which if you did not notice, this means that Prince was able to get from Chigiri more than what Ego was able to get, which further confirms why the Neo Egoist League was truly needed in order for Japan to reach a new level. Because training under the pros and seeing actual U20 players like Kaiser and Lorenzo really helps the Blue Lockers reach a new level, and Chigiri is definitely one of the best examples of this. However, and going back to his shots, while very weak and conditional of a shot, with his insane speed and dribbling, Chigiri is more than capable of getting into his golden zone, resulting in a very reproducible golden formula for goals, making Chigiri the complete package for a striker, with weapons and techniques honed specifically for piercing with brute speed and then scoring, whether alone or when receiving a pass, a very deadly threat if I say so myself. But can he beat the Blind Sword Master at the end of Blue Lock's dojo? Yukimiya Kenyu, the sinking ship, and the previously known as the One-on-One Emperor. A very interesting character to say the least, as he played a huge role in the story of Blue Lock, by giving us the biggest example of how rationality is truly king. and how irrational behaviors often hurts us more than anything. However, after that squabble with Isagi, Yuki managed to grow insanely, and now, as we've seen in the PXG game, is one of the most threatening strikers in the entirety of Blue Lock, and one that I truly believe has a bright future ahead of him, as the maturity he showed in order to change himself is truly commendable. However, before I get ahead of myself, first let's talk about his physical stats. And again, since the name of the game in today's video is speed, let's start with Yuki's strongest physical aspect, which is definitely his speed. Now, to be honest, he's not on the level of his opponent today, Chigiri. However, if I were to make tiers, I would put him in the second tier along with Kaiser, Shido and Otoya. As you see, Yuki is a speed demon. And actually, more importantly, he is one of the best players to utilize their speed, as we will see in his abilities and weapons. However, next, let's talk about his strength and raw power. His playing style and his dueling ability require him to have a somewhat strong physique. However, what I think is off the charts regarding Yuki is without a doubt his endurance, as keeping up that speed and that level of dribbling throughout an entire game is definitely very commendable. However, much like Chigiri, and again because this is a game of ticking bombs, Yuki's curse is not in his knees but rather in his eyes, because when he gets tired his illness kicks in, his vision becomes impaired. But next, let's talk about his jumping ability, which honestly has no feats to speak of, and so nothing really impressive here, and with that we are done with his physical stats. And now it's time for the interesting stuff. It's time for his abilities and weapons. Now, without a doubt, for someone who has been labeled the one-on-one emperor, you know that Yuki's dueling ability, or specifically his dribbling ability, is his biggest and strongest weapon. You see, in the realm of Blue Lock, Yuki was the first player to introduce a dribbling ability that allows him to actually take a whole team apart, even against beasts like Rin and Shido. While before we've seen Bachira do that, however he did it against fodder. However, the case with Yuki, despite Rin and Shido being there, he still was able to take the whole team apart. You see, unlike other active dribblers, Yuki's dribbling ability takes full advantage of his insane speed, where we see him trick in one direction and then burst with full speed into the other, taking most players by surprise. Even speedsters like Shido and Nero gets shaken off by this dribbling ability. Furthermore, Yuki being the lone swordsman that he is actually one of the few players who is able to dribble through and around his teammates while destroying the other team, which funny enough is very unique to him, as we are yet to see a player who utilizes his teammates as obstacles to the defense rather than just passing like other players. And in all honesty, in the PXG game he even took it a step further. You see, after losing miserably to Isagi in the Manshine City game, Yuki now learns that football is not just one-on-one, as he needs to account for other players in order for his dribbling to be more effective. This actually, while not seeming that important, enabled him to even react to Metavision users, which honestly was such a great of a feat, as he took both Isagi and Karaso by surprise, which is something very rare to see. Usually the kryptonite to Metavision is unpredictability, like we've seen with Rin and Baro. However, Yuki forced his way through with brute speed and an elegant dribbling ability, which, as far as we've seen, makes him the only player who was able to dribble past Metavision perfect positioning, with the exception of course being Berserker, Ren and Loki. And again, as I always say in my videos, rivaling the pros in any matter is definitely one of the greatest feats for the U20 players, and really cemented Yuki's ability to pierce through. However, that's not all. I'm not calling him the lone swordsman for no reason. As you see, Yuki has one of the best shooting abilities in Blue Lock. With his signature move, the gyro shot, Yuki does not even need his course to be completely free, as he can simply wobble around the defender and reach the net. However, and despite this being very impressive, he learns the hard way that players with insane perception like Aiku, or the pros like Prince, or hell, even players with insane reach like Aryu, are capable of meeting his shot and stopping it before it reaches the net. And this is because a gyro shot by its nature is rather slow, because it goes out of reach then turns towards the goal. A lot of players are able to react to it. And so, and taking a page from Chris Prince, Yuki was able to fuse the gyro with the knuckle shot, enabling him to have one of the most unpredictable shots in the entirety of the show, as basically even with Ryo knowing where the ball is going, he still was unable to meet it simply because the ball was wobbling in the air. However, and if you could believe it, that's not all. You see, again, after that setback in the Manshine City game, Yuki seems to have unlocked a sort of adaptability, as now every time he plays a game, he is improving and adding new weapons to his arsenal. And this time, he actually added one of the best weapons in all of Blue Lock, and actually the second most powerful ocular ability at that. I'm talking, of course, the Predator Eyes, which, as far as we've seen in the PXG game, it should be the goal course hunting ability, where Yuki can hunt a very narrow space from where he can force his shot through. And we're not sure here because in the panel he was shown to be looking at the goalkeeper. However, from the reaction of the defenders and then Charles confirming it, it seems that it is the goal course hunting ability. And with this new weapon, it means that in a split second, while dribbling, Yuki can force a shot that no one could actually anticipate and no one could actually react to. And honestly, I truly believe if he was given enough time in the PXG game, he would have definitely scored with the sum of his amazing abilities. Because, and ironically to his previous self, Yuki right now is one of the most complete strikers in Blue Lock. However, can Yuki actually tame the Red Panther? Yuki vs Chigiri, a matchup of the underrated kings. As you see, to me these two players are honestly one of the most underrated players in the entirety of the show, making this matchup specifically very unique, seeing that both players got overshadowed a lot in their respective teams. And as we will see in the case of Chigiri, I am even questioning what the writer is doing with him. However, let's first start with Yukimiya, who prior to the U20 game was ranked the 5th player in Blue Lock, but ended up not really performing that well in the U20 match. For a striker not to score any goal throughout a game, it really hurt him, despite him actually creating a lot of opportunities. And mind you, he did that all on his own, which back then seemed to be as a very strong selling point. However, as we all know, in the Manshine City game, doing things alone really hurt him. But losing to Isigi specifically in that game was really the key into him achieving a new level, a level that he showed us a glimpse of in the PXG game. Despite him being subbed in for only few minutes, he managed to create one of the most dangerous opportunities for Bastard, and even stole the win had it not been for Charles' insane vision. And as I said before, losing to Charles' vision is not really an anti-feat, even Kaiser and Isigi lost to him multiple times. And I truly believe had the game extended for more time, the new Yuki would have definitely scored, with his newfound Predator Eyes and much improved playing style, where now he accounts for other players very well. Something that honestly was his biggest shortcoming back in the day. And the reason I am bringing this into the conclusion is because, as you all know, to me, a great mentality is a prerequisite to being a great player. And I feel in this point specifically, Yuki evolved so much, and he definitely beats Chigiri here. However, let's take the comparison to their playing styles. When it comes to raw speed, Chigiri definitely clears Yuki. However, it's not that big of a gap. You see, in the Bastard game, Chigiri would have scored had it not been for the intervention of Yuki, who came sprinting from the other side. And he was so fast at that, he actually shocked even Chigiri, who did not think anyone could keep up with his speed. Meaning that despite Chigiri winning the speed points for sure, the gap is not that big. Something that could be said again about their shooting ability. However, this time I feel it is the other way around, where Chigiri's shooting is definitely not great. However, his golden zone is actually perfect. And as Prince said, through a weak but very accurate shot, Chigiri could turn a lot of opportunities into goals. However, I really do not see him compared to Yuki in this point. Not only is his gyro shot harder to deal with and stronger than Chigiri's shot, but also even in terms of accuracy, nothing really beats the Predator Eyes. And in fact, it goes even beyond that. As you see, Yuki actually evolved it in the Manshine City game, where he actually introduced a level of unpredictability to his shots, enabling him a new way to finish the job, which is actually the opposite of Chigiri's rigid golden formula. And I know this might not seem as a big difference for you guys, however, I really want to focus on something here, because I feel it is so important for this matchup. However, first let's talk about their dribbling. Now, while Yuki is definitely more experienced with his dribbling, I definitely see it inferior to Chigiri's zigzags, who are actually very hard to deal with. In fact, the only way that we've seen players stop Chigiri is either actually preventing him from sprinting like Corona did, or meeting him in his golden zone like Yuki and Kaiser did. And don't get me wrong, if the other team doesn't expect it, both players could take them apart by themselves. However, I feel Chigiri is a bit more threatening than Yuki. And I know what you might say, that Yuki's dribbling evolved in the PXG game, where now he accounts for other players while doing his moves. However, the way Chigiri penetrates the defense with brute speed is honestly just astonishing. And for that reason, and despite me loving the new Yuki that was able to adapt to Isagi, I still think in terms of dribbling, Chigiri is slightly better than Yuki, simply because his speed bursts are more threatening than Yuki's. However, this leads us straight to a previous matchup that I did, which was between Bachira and Chigiri. And that matchup ended in favor of Chigiri because at that time, after the Bastard vs Manshine game, Chigiri definitely was on a whole different level. However, the way he was performing in the other games made me really question that decision. And this is what I said before, that things get a bit dicey in this matchup. You would expect Chigiri to perform insanely well against, for example, PXG, or even better against FC Barca. However, for some reason he didn't. I mean, granted, he scored 1 goal against PXG. However, in the Barca game, he did absolutely nothing. Even the goal he scored was all attributed to Rio. It was Rio who built that attack, and it was Rio who led Chigiri to his golden zone. And this honestly made me beg the question, if Chigiri is ranked number 2 in the NEL in terms of dribbling, sharing the spot with Lorenzo, and being second only to Bachira, why wouldn't he perform that well in the Barca game? Why wouldn't he do what he did in the Bastard game and destroy them on multiple occasions? I really do not get it, especially because the only player who could match him in terms of speed is Otoya. And this is really mind-boggling to me, because you would expect the Chigiri that we've seen in the Bastard game to completely dominate that game and destroy FC Barca. But honestly, for some reason, he just faded into obscurity. While, for example, other players like Bachira, Otoya and Rio were performing really well. This honestly made me question what the writer is doing with Chigiri. It seems that the writer did not know where to take Chigiri beyond just keeping him close to Rio and Kunigami, his friends. And honestly, this alone almost gives the match up to Yuki, if it wasn't for the fact that Yuki is not better off. However, the case with Yuki is a bit explainable. He is competing not only against Kunigami, not only against Isagi, but also against Kaiser as well. And speaking of Kaiser, let's get back to the shooting point. You see, by introducing irregularity to his shot, Yuki actually increased his shooting stat tremendously. As you see, even guaranteed formulas like the Kaiser Impact mixed with Metavision and the Predator Eyes could crumble and be countered easily, like we've seen Rin, Charles and Lorenzo do. And this is actually what pushed Kaiser into developing the Magnus technique. Also, he can mitigate other players expecting his shot, like we've seen it happen in his goal against PXG. And I can't help but believe that if the team expects Chigiri's golden formula, they expect his zone, he actually gets easily countered, and this definitely hurts him a lot. He honestly could dribble all he wants, if he can't finish the job then it's all for no reason. And when you couple this with the fact that Yuki is performing well in the presence of Kaiser and Isagi, I am really leaning towards giving him the W. Mind you, I honestly believe if Chigiri kept up the level he showed in the Bastard game, he would have definitely won. But for some reason the writer completely forgot about him, and so I honestly could not see him winning here at all. And if you're wondering how could Yuki win despite him being much lower in salary than Chigiri, as I said, he is sharing the striker spot with Kunigami, Isagi and Kaiser. Kunigami aside, Isagi and Kaiser alone are very hard to compete with or against when it comes to scoring. And I mean, as you all know, I think Isagi is slightly better than Kaiser, despite Kaiser being insanely ahead when it comes to salary. And so for this matchup specifically, I think because the writer forgot about Chigiri, Yuki will be the player winning today's matchup and the one walking with a W. However, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.